I still remember the exact moment I realized something was off. It was the week before Christmas, and my phone buzzed with a group message from my family. "We're having Christmas dinner at Luigi's this year. You have to come." At first, I felt a flicker of excitement. I hadn't seen most of them in months, and Christmas was always supposed to be about warmth, laughter, and catching up. But there was something about the way the message was worded. It didn't feel like a genuine invitation. It felt like a command, a test. I tried not to overthink it. I replied, "Sure, I'll be there," and tucked my phone away. I kept telling myself that maybe I was just being paranoid. My family had always been a little complicated. There was Aunt Karen, who always had a story about someone she barely knew. Uncle Marcus, who somehow turned every conversation into a debate. And then my cousins, each carrying their little quirks and rivalries, all under the guise of holiday cheer. But this year, something about their messages felt different, almost calculated. When the day arrived, I dressed up nicely, trying to ignore the pit in my stomach. I wanted to believe in the magic of Christmas, the joy of family gatherings. As I pulled up to the restaurant, I noticed the valet was unusually prompt, almost too attentive, as if they were expecting me. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. But the minute I stepped inside, the air felt heavier than it should on a festive night. The lights were warm, the decorations beautiful, but the smiles greeting me were too polished. "Finally, you're here," Aunt Karen said, throwing her arms around me with an exaggerated enthusiasm. Uncle Marcus clapped me on the back a little too hard. "We saved you the best seat," said my cousin Jamal, motioning to the table. And that's when I saw it. The table was set in a semicircle, not just for meals, but as if designed for a performance. Everyone's eyes were on me, and I had the creeping sense that the performance wasn't for fun. It was for something else. The waiter came over and handed me the menu. As I scanned through it, I realized the prices were higher than I remembered. Really high. And not in a fancy restaurant kind of way. They were expensive in a way that made me wonder if someone had already done the math. The conversations around me were flowing, people laughing, sharing stories, but every joke, every anecdote, felt pointed in a way I couldn't quite explain. It was like they were testing me, watching how I would react. I laughed when they laughed, nodded when they nodded, trying to blend in, trying to feel the warmth I had hoped for. But the pit in my stomach kept growing. There was a subtle tension, almost like I was stepping on a tightrope, and everyone was waiting to see if I'd fall. And then came the moment that made my heart sink. Uncle Marcus leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, since you've been doing so well this year, maybe you can take care of the check tonight. You're the only one in the family who's actually working full-time." His voice was casual, but his eyes were calculating. I forced a laugh, thinking maybe he was joking. But the way everyone at the table nodded, smiling in that unnerving way, I realized it wasn't a joke. It was a trap. Every smile, every compliment, every friendly gesture, they had all been carefully calculated to set me up for this moment. And suddenly, I wasn't part of a family gathering anymore. I was part of a plan I hadn't signed up for. My mind raced. How had it gotten to this? I had always been generous, always happy to treat people I cared about. But this was different. This was manipulation wrapped in holiday cheer. I could feel my palms getting sweaty as the waiter came back, ready to take our order. And that's when I noticed the way my family members were watching me, leaning back slightly, as if waiting for me to say the words that would seal the night. "I'll take care of it," I thought, clenching my jaw. But inside, I wasn't sure if I could. The conversation moved on. Aunt Karen talked about her new diet, Cousin Jamal complained about work, and Uncle Marcus casually mentioned a new car he was thinking about buying. All the while, I sat there, pretending to listen, pretending to be part of the laughter. But my mind kept drifting back to the check. I knew what they were doing. I could feel it in the way they glanced at the menu when I wasn't looking. I could see the subtle smirks that appeared when my eyes wandered. And the more I realized what was happening, the angrier I got. But I couldn't let them see that yet. Not tonight. As the first course arrived, a plate of pasta with rich, creamy sauce, I thought about my options. I could quietly slip out, pretend something urgent came up, and avoid the trap entirely. But leaving would come with its own consequences. Aunt Karen's dramatic disappointment, Uncle Marcus's subtle glares, the judgment of the cousins who would whisper about it later. I was stuck in a delicate balance between confrontation and compromise, and neither felt safe. I kept my focus on the food, trying to ground myself, trying to convince myself this was just another dinner. But deep down, I knew this was bigger. This was about more than money. It was about control, about the way my family had subtly cornered me into a role I hadn't agreed to. And the thought that I was alone in seeing it made me feel even more isolated. Then came the moment that made everything crystal clear. My cousin Jamal, leaning over with a glass of wine, said casually, "We just want you to relax tonight. Don't worry about anything. Just, handle the bill when the time comes. You've got this." His tone was friendly, but the words hit me like ice. They weren't here for Christmas. They weren't here for me. They were here for the money. Every compliment, every hug, every shared laugh had been part of a script, written with one purpose. I swallowed hard, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. I had to figure out what to do next. Pay the check and quietly seethe? Call them out and risk a confrontation? Or maybe, just maybe, turn the situation in a way they never expected? I took a deep breath, knowing that whatever choice I made next would set the tone for the rest of the evening, and maybe for my entire relationship with this family moving forward. And just as I was gathering my thoughts, the waiter returned with the wine, setting it down with a polite smile. All eyes turned toward me again, like predators circling. My heart raced. I could feel the tension thickening. The laughter around the table suddenly felt hollow, the holiday magic completely drained. And at that moment, I realized that this Christmas dinner was going to be nothing like any other. How I handled this moment, this trap disguised as a celebration, was going to change everything. I looked around the table, meeting their eyes one by one, trying to read the intentions behind the smiles. And then I knew this wasn't just about paying a check. It was about proving something. About showing them that I wasn't someone they could manipulate, no matter how festive the evening looked. But the question was, could I do it without ruining the night entirely? Or was I about to walk right into the exact trap they had set for me? This sets up suspense, introduces key family characters, and creates a strong hook while keeping the language simple and human-centered. It also leaves the story unresolved, perfect for continuing into the main video. I took another sip of wine, letting it settle in my stomach, but it did little to calm the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my mind. I glanced around the table again, trying to read the expressions on everyone's faces. On the surface, they were cheerful, smiling, and animated, but beneath that, there was a strange, almost predatory energy. Every laugh, every casual remark felt rehearsed. I realized I had been blind to it for a long time, maybe because I had wanted so desperately to belong. But tonight, everything was different. I could feel it. As the main course arrived, the tension didn't ease. The waiter carefully placed the dishes in front of us, and I noticed the way my family's eyes lingered on me a little too long. It wasn't about the food. It was about me, about testing me, about seeing how far I would bend. Aunt Karen, who usually talked nonstop about her own accomplishments, suddenly became unusually quiet. She smiled at me in that tight, controlled way she used when she wanted something. Uncle Marcus leaned back, pretending to check his watch, but I could see the smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. And Jamal, ever the charming cousin, kept shooting glances that said more than his words ever did. I started thinking about how we had arrived at this point. Growing up, family gatherings were supposed to feel safe, like coming home. But over the years, I had noticed patterns. Subtle manipulations, offhand comments meant to make me feel guilty, hints that I should be the one to pick up the slack while others relaxed. At first, I ignored them. I told myself it was normal family banter, just harmless teasing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't harmless. And tonight, it was no longer subtle. I remembered last Christmas, when we all went to that small ski lodge. At the end of the night, I had ended up covering the expenses for the entire group because it was only fair, according to Uncle Marcus. Back then, I laughed it off, embarrassed at the thought of challenging them. But now, sitting here at this expensive restaurant, the same feeling was creeping back. The difference was this time I could see it coming from a mile away. They weren't asking, they were expecting. I tried to focus on conversation, to participate in the holiday cheer. Aunt Karen talked about her new job, Uncle Marcus complained about the traffic on the way here, and Jamal kept telling funny stories about work, but the humor felt forced. I started noticing little things I hadn't before. The way my cousin's eyes would dart toward the menu whenever I got distracted, the way my aunt's hand would hover near her wallet, as if reminding me of what was coming. Even the waiter's timing seemed off, arriving just as a family member mentioned something about handling expenses. It was subtle, but it was there. I leaned back in my chair, pretending to check my phone, just to buy a moment to breathe. My mind was spinning. I had always believed family was supposed to be about trust, about sharing joy without conditions. But this felt like a game I hadn't agreed to play. And the worst part was that I was trapped in it. There was nowhere to escape, no easy way out. Every option seemed to have consequences, and the longer I sat here, the more I realized how carefully orchestrated this entire evening was. As the conversation shifted, my uncle started talking about investments and cars, hinting casually at big purchases he had made recently. "It's important to have someone reliable to cover unexpected expenses," he said, not looking at me directly, but his words landed like stones in my stomach. I felt the familiar tug of anger mixed with disbelief. How could they sit here, laugh and eat, and treat me like this? It wasn't just rude, it was a betrayal, wrapped up in holiday traditions and fake smiles. I caught myself scanning the other diners in the restaurant, wondering if they could sense what was happening. Were they seeing me, sitting here quietly, forced into a role I never asked for? Did they notice the tension between my family and me? I felt exposed, like a character in someone else's story, acting out a part written without my consent. The more I thought about it, the more trapped I felt. I took a deep breath and tried to remind myself that this was still a Christmas dinner, a chance to connect, even if things were strained. But connection requires sincerity, and I could feel the lack of it at every glance, every laugh, every carefully phrased comment. My family wasn't here to celebrate me, or the holidays. They were here to make me their target. I hated that I could see it so clearly, hated that it felt like I was being punished for noticing. As dessert menus were brought around, the tension reached a new level. I noticed Jamal leaning back, pretending to check his phone, but I could see the corner of his mouth twitching as if suppressing a grin. Aunt Karen suddenly leaned toward me, her voice soft but strangely commanding. "We're so glad you're doing well this year. You know, we can all pitch in, but since you're successful, you could handle the bill." Her words were coated in sweetness, but underneath, they were sharp. Every syllable carefully measured to make me feel like it was my duty, my responsibility, my obligation. I felt a tightness in my chest, the mixture of disbelief, anger, and hurt becoming almost too much to handle. My mind flashed back to all the other times I had been taken advantage of, small moments that I had shrugged off because I wanted to belong. And suddenly it all made sense. This wasn't just about Christmas or about money. This was about patterns. About a family that had learned how to manipulate me, how to bend my generosity to their advantage, and tonight, they were executing it to perfection. I looked at my uncle, who was chatting with the waiter, and wondered if he even realized what he was doing. Or maybe he did, and that was the cruel part. Maybe they all did. I realized that my anger wasn't just about the money. It was about recognition, about respect, about finally seeing my family for who they really were. And in that moment, I knew that I had a choice. I could play along, silently seethe, and let them have their way. Or I could find a way to push back, to reclaim some control over the evening, even if it risked confrontation. The restaurant around us felt suddenly smaller, the cheerful chatter of other diners fading into the background. All that existed in that moment was me and the invisible web my family had spun, waiting for me to act. I could feel my heart pounding, the anticipation building like the quiet before a storm. And I knew, deep down, that no matter what happened next, this Christmas dinner would change everything, not just my view of my family, but how I chose to interact with them from this point forward. As I reached for my glass, Pretending to sip, I caught a subtle exchange between Aunt Karen and Jamal. A small nod, a glance that I wasn't supposed to see, and suddenly everything became clear. They had planned this carefully, rehearsed the lines, set the stage. And yet, in that same instant, I felt a flicker of something else. Possibility. Maybe there was a way to turn the situation around. Maybe I didn't have to play the part they had written for me. But the question was, how? And more importantly, could I do it without losing myself in the process? And that's when I noticed the check arriving at the table, neatly folded and placed in the center, like a silent challenge. Every eye in the family flicked toward me, subtle but unmistakable. The air seemed to thicken, the room shrinking around us, and I realized that the moment I had been dreading all evening was finally here. I had to make a choice, and whatever I did next would set the tone for everything that followed. This continuation deepens the family dynamics, builds suspense, and expands the context, setting up tension without resolving it, perfect for keeping viewers engaged and eager for the next part. I stared at the check in the center of the table, my fingers tightening around the edge of the menu. The restaurant around us hummed with holiday chatter, the clinking of silverware, and the soft murmur of other diners, but none of it reached me anymore. My focus was completely on the table and the silent, almost conspiratorial glances being exchanged across it. I could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on me, heavier than any gift I had ever received. Aunt Karen leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly on the table. "It's really no trouble," she said softly, with that carefully practiced sweetness that always made me pause. "We just thought since you've been doing so well, it would be only fair if you handled tonight." Her words were gentle, but the intent was sharp, like a velvet knife. I could see the way Jamal's eyes flicked toward mine, the tiny smirk he tried to hide behind a sip of water. Uncle Marcus, pretending to study the wine list, gave me a subtle nod, as if to reinforce the unspoken expectation. I felt the blood drain from my face for a moment. This wasn't just about money, and I knew it. It was about control, about my family testing the limits of what I would do for them, about watching me squirm under the guise of holiday cheer. I had to be careful. Any wrong move could turn the evening into a disaster, but playing along would only make me part of their manipulation. My mind raced through all the possibilities, trying to find a way out without humiliating myself or triggering an argument. As I considered my options, my cousin Jamal began telling a story about his new apartment, the way he had decorated it with lights and ornaments. Normally, I would have laughed along, but tonight, his laughter felt like a challenge. Every word seemed calculated, like he was trying to distract me, to make me feel like going along with the check was just part of the conversation. I caught myself analyzing everything, his tone, his body language, even the timing of the punchlines. Everything felt orchestrated. I thought about my own past generosity, all the times I had quietly picked up the slack for family members who never thanked me, who never even noticed. I remembered my last birthday dinner, when I had paid for everyone's meals without a single word of appreciation. Back then, I had smiled and pretended it was fine, telling myself that family was supposed to support each other. But now, sitting at this table, I realized how much that pattern had been reinforced, how my willingness to give had been turned into a tool against me. While I wrestled with my own thoughts, Aunt Karen shifted the conversation toward childhood memories. She reminded everyone of a Christmas years ago when I had insisted on making everyone's favorite dessert, and how proud she had been. "You've always been so thoughtful," she said, her eyes meeting mine with a softness that almost fooled me. But beneath it, I could see the expectation lurking, the unspoken message that thoughtfulness now came with a price. Jamal chimed in, "Yeah, it's kind of like, we know you can handle this, right?" His smile was casual, but it felt like a nudge, a silent dare. I tried to mask my unease with a laugh, but inside, my heart was pounding. I could feel the tension thickening, like a storm about to break. I realized that my family had rehearsed this moment for weeks, maybe even months. Every joke, every compliment, every memory they had brought up tonight wasn't random. They were carefully selected to make me feel appreciated, validated, and ultimately responsible. And I was expected to take the bait. As the desserts arrived, A decadent display of chocolate tarts and creamy custards, I noticed something else. How the waiter lingered near Uncle Marcus, subtly attentive, almost as if waiting for instructions. I couldn't help but wonder if this had been planned down to the smallest detail. Every element of the evening, the timing of the courses, the positioning of the table, even the service, seemed designed to put me in this one position. And yet, despite the precision of it all, I felt a spark of defiance rising inside me. I remembered my best friend, who had always warned me about this side of my family. "You give too much," they had said. "They'll take it, and they'll keep taking it if you don't set boundaries." Back then, I had brushed it off. But tonight, as I looked at the smiles around the table, I realized my friend had been right. This wasn't generosity anymore, it was exploitation, and the longer I waited, the more power I gave them. I shifted slightly in my chair, trying to gauge how the night might unfold. There were so many angles to consider. Could I leave quietly, claim an emergency? Could I pretend I hadn't seen the check and hope someone else would take over? Or could I confront them head-on and risk turning a festive night into a full-blown argument? The possibilities seemed endless, and none of them felt entirely safe. Meanwhile, Aunt Karen and Jamal began discussing a charity event they were planning after Christmas. "It's always better when someone like you can help cover the costs," Aunt Karen said casually, as if speaking to a colleague rather than a family member. I realized in that moment that they had woven the expectation of paying into every part of the conversation, every aspect of their evening. The check wasn't just a bill. It was the centerpiece of a carefully constructed story in which I was supposed to play a predictable role. I could feel my anger simmering beneath the surface. I thought about all the subtle ways my family had controlled me over the years, how they praised me for small favors but never acknowledged the bigger sacrifices I had made, how they used guilt and compliments like levers to manipulate me. And now, tonight, it had all come to a head. I wasn't just dealing with a check. I was dealing with years of patterns, all converging in this one tense, glittering moment. I noticed my uncle catching my eye and giving me a small, knowing smile. It was a look I had seen many times before, one that said, "We've got you, you can't back out." My stomach twisted. The power dynamics in this room were suffocating, and yet there was a part of me that wanted to fight back, to show them that I wasn't someone to be taken for granted.
But how? And at what cost?
I tried to focus on the dessert in front of me, letting the sweet smell of chocolate and caramel distract me, but the tension refused to lift. Jamal leaned forward, telling another story, and this time, it felt like a direct challenge. He laughed at his own joke, and I caught the subtle smirk from Aunt Karen. They were in sync, performing this act, testing me without ever saying a word. The check, sitting in the center of the table, was the final act. I thought about the dynamics of the family as a whole, the way roles had been assigned over the years without anyone ever discussing them. I had always been the responsible one, the helper, the one who paid attention and kept things running smoothly. Others had learned to rely on that, to exploit it, often unconsciously. But tonight, it wasn't unconscious. Tonight, it was deliberate. They had planned this, choreographed it, and I was the final piece of the puzzle. As I reached for my fork, trying to act casual, I felt a surge of clarity. I wasn't just sitting here to pay a bill. I was sitting here to confront a pattern, to navigate a family dynamic that had shaped my entire life. And in that moment, I realized that the next move I made would determine more than just the outcome of this dinner. It could change how I interacted with my family forever. I glanced at the check again. The eyes around the table were on me, calm, expectant, as if nothing could surprise them. But the truth was, I was far from powerless. I had a choice, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of that choice fully. I just had to figure out how to act on it without letting them see my hesitation. And as I sat there, heart pounding, the restaurant lights reflecting off the polished table, I knew that the evening had only just begun. The check wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, far more personal. And I realized that this Christmas dinner, which had seemed like a simple family gathering, was about to test me in ways I had never imagined. This section expands the main conflict. delves into character motivations, explores the family's manipulative dynamics, and adds layers of tension and suspense. The story continues to build toward confrontation without resolving it, keeping viewers engaged and curious. I could feel the weight of the check staring up at me from the center of the table like a challenge I couldn't ignore. Every family member was watching, though none of them said a word directly. The room seemed smaller somehow, every laugh and clink of silverware echoing too loudly in my ears. I took a deep breath, pretending to study the dessert menu, but my eyes kept darting back to that folded piece of paper. It wasn't just a bill, it was a test, and they were all waiting to see if I would take the bait. Aunt Karen leaned back, smiling in that quiet, measured way she always used when she wanted something. "You know," she said lightly, "it's kind of nice knowing we can count on you. You've always been so responsible." Her words were soft, almost complimentary, but I could feel the pressure behind them, like invisible hands pushing me toward the check. I gritted my teeth and forced a laugh, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, well, someone's got to," I muttered, my tone tighter than I intended. Jamal, sensing my unease, leaned forward. "Don't worry about a thing tonight. Seriously, just enjoy yourself." His smile was wide, almost too cheerful, and I felt my skin crawl. I knew exactly what he meant. Enjoy myself, while taking care of everything they had subtly hinted I was supposed to handle. I wanted to argue, to call it out, but the words caught in my throat. Any confrontation now could turn the room into a battlefield, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Uncle Marcus, who had been quiet for most of the meal, suddenly spoke up. "It's Christmas," he said in that casual tone that somehow always carried authority. "Family sticks together. We know you're good with this sort of thing, so we figured it made sense." He nodded at me with that knowing look, as if he expected gratitude, and not a single doubt. My stomach twisted. I had never felt so trapped in my life, sitting at a table surrounded by people who smiled at me while silently expecting me to bend to their will. I tried to focus on the dessert in front of me, a rich chocolate tart topped with berries, but it tasted like ashes in my mouth. I pushed the plate slightly away and leaned back, pretending to check my phone. I couldn't let them see how much this was affecting me. Every glance, every subtle nudge from my family reminded me that they were perfectly in sync, perfectly aware of the effect they had on me. The more I sat there, the more I realized I had been conditioned for this moment, and now it was happening in full force. Aunt Karen started reminiscing about old Christmases, stories of family vacations and shared gifts, trying to soften the tension with nostalgia. But instead of comfort, her words only added pressure. She had carefully chosen memories that highlighted my past generosity, my willingness to give, my habit of taking responsibility for everyone else. It was subtle, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention, but tonight it was clear. They weren't celebrating me. They were setting me up. I caught Jamal smirking at me across the table, leaning back like he was watching a game unfold. The realization hit me all at once. This wasn't about a meal. This was about control. They had orchestrated this entire evening, every story, every compliment, every small touch of nostalgia, to make me feel obligated. The check in the center of the table was the final act, the culmination of a plan I hadn't even known existed. I felt my pulse quicken. My mind raced through the scenarios. I could say nothing, pay the check quietly, and leave with a bitter taste in my mouth. I could confront them and risk a fight, possibly shattering what little holiday cheer remained. Or I could find some way to reclaim control, to turn the table in a way they hadn't expected. But how? And could I do it without losing my temper, without giving them the satisfaction of seeing me flustered? The waiter returned, and I could feel my family's eyes tracking every movement I made. Aunt Karen gave me that soft, expectant look. Jamal's smirk widened slightly, and Uncle Marcus's nod carried silent reassurance. Or was it a challenge? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that I was at the center of a storm that no one else seemed to see. The air was charged with unspoken tension, every second stretching longer than the last. I tried to focus on something else, anything else, and my eyes wandered to the other diners. They were oblivious to the silent battle taking place at my table. They laughed, clinked glasses, and enjoyed their meals, completely unaware of the trap I was in. A part of me envied them, envied their freedom from manipulation and expectation. And yet, the thought of letting my family see me bow down, even subtly, made my jaw clench. As I reached for my glass of water, I overheard Jamal joking about a new car he wanted, subtly weaving in a comment about responsible family members covering the costs for a fun night out. My heart sank. Everything tonight had been a careful setup. Every compliment, every joke, every story was designed to put me in this position. I felt the anger rising, the old familiar frustration of years past, the frustration of always being the one who gave more than I received. I glanced at Aunt Karen again, who was smiling in that almost imperceptible way that made you feel guilty for questioning her intentions. I realized she had been practicing this smile for years, perfected it to appear sincere, while keeping the strings of control firmly in her hands. And I thought about Uncle Marcus, who had always excelled at making everything seem casual while subtly asserting authority. And then there was Jamal, whose charm masked an unspoken understanding with the others. Together, they were a unit, and I was the target. The more I thought about it, the tighter my chest felt. I wanted to scream, to stand up and call out their manipulation, but the words wouldn't come. I had to play it carefully. Any wrong move could make me the villain, the one who ruined Christmas, instead of the one who finally took control. And yet, every fiber of my being was screaming at me not to give in, not to let them win so easily. I noticed my hand trembling slightly as I reached toward the check, a surge of adrenaline making my thoughts sharper, more focused. I had to decide quickly, but I also had to be strategic. They were testing me, watching for hesitation, for any sign of weakness. If I acted too fast, they would think they had succeeded. If I waited too long, I might lose my nerve. The tension in the room was palpable now, like a wire stretched, so tight it might snap at any moment. Aunt Karen cleared her throat softly, drawing my attention. "Go on," she said, her voice low and calm. "You can handle it." Jamal's smirk deepened, and Uncle Marcus gave me that subtle nod again. Every eye was on me, every gesture calculated, and I realized in that moment that I was standing at the edge of something big. The check wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of all the expectations, all the control, all the silent power struggles that had been going on for years. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I looked around at their faces, trying to read their intentions, trying to anticipate their next move. The room felt heavier, the air almost electric. Every second stretched longer, the suspense building like a storm about to break. And I knew that what I did next would set the tone for the rest of the night, maybe even for how I handled my family forever. The dessert sat untouched, the check in the center, and the holiday lights reflected off the polished surfaces of the table. Time seemed to slow. The smiles around me were no longer comforting. They were traps. And as I finally reached for the edge of the bill, heart pounding, I felt the tension peak. Every muscle in my body was on edge. Every thought focused on what would come next. This was it, the moment I had been dreading, the moment that would define the rest of the evening. This section builds maximum suspense, heightens tension, explores the family's manipulations, and keeps viewers on the edge of their seats, leading right up to the climax without revealing the resolution. I sat there, fingers hovering just above the check, my heart racing like it might burst through my chest. The restaurant lights reflected in the polished table, glinting off my family's smiles, which now felt almost predatory. I was poised, caught between giving in and standing my ground, when suddenly, Aunt Karen's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up, and her expression shifted ever so slightly, just enough to make me notice. A subtle flicker of tension crossed her face, though she immediately masked it with a casual smile. "I just got a message from Mom," she said, glancing at the screen and then back at me. "She says she forgot to mention there's an unexpected expense for the catering at home. A Christmas is getting more expensive this year, apparently." She chuckled lightly, but the way she looked at me made it clear that the implied expectation was obvious. My chest tightened. Was this part of the plan? Had they deliberately set me up not just for the restaurant bill, but for some additional financial obligation I hadn't even anticipated? Before I could even respond, Jamal leaned in with a mischievous grin. Yeah, it's crazy how fast costs pile up, right? We were just talking and thought, if you're handling tonight, maybe you could cover a little extra for the catering too. Just a tiny bit. His tone was casual, almost playful, but I could feel the underlying trap. The check wasn't just the check anymore. It was the beginning of a chain of financial expectations, each layered to corner me further. My mind raced. I had walked into this dinner thinking it would be about family, about laughter, and shared memories. And now, it felt like a battlefield, each word, each gesture carefully calculated to test me. I realized they weren't just expecting me to pay, they were escalating, and if I gave in now, it would only encourage further manipulation. My hands tightened into fists under the table. How had it come to this? How had I allowed myself to be placed in this position once again? Uncle Marcus, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. It's really not a big deal. We just thought it would be easier if you helped out. You've always been reliable, so why not? I caught the subtle look he gave Jamal, a glance that said they were united, two pieces of the same plan. I could feel my jaw tighten as I realized the full scope of what they were doing. It wasn't about a Christmas dinner. It was about testing me, controlling me, and seeing how far I would bend. As I sat there, trying to gather my thoughts, I noticed another detail that made my blood run cold. Across the table, Jamal had subtly shifted some papers, almost as if to hide them. I leaned in slightly, pretending to reach for my fork, and caught a glimpse. There it was, a list of expenses, meticulously calculated, totaling much more than the restaurant bill alone. They had planned this down to the last dollar. They had coordinated it with my absence, my generosity, my willingness to help. And now, tonight, they were executing it perfectly. I felt a surge of disbelief, mixed with anger. How could my family do this? How could they wrap manipulation in holiday cheer, in laughter, in smiles that were meant to disarm me? My mind flashed through memories, old family dinners, small favors I had done, moments I had sacrificed for them, each one suddenly taking on a new meaning. I realized that I had been caught in the same pattern again, and they had escalated it. This was no longer just about paying the check. It was about control, about proving a point, about seeing me follow their plan without question. Aunt Karen's voice broke through my thoughts again. Oh, and by the way, I heard from her cousin Lisa. She said she might drop by later, and she mentioned she can't contribute this year, so maybe you could help cover for her too. Her words were innocent on the surface, but the implication was obvious. They weren't just escalating, they were piling expectation upon expectation, testing not just my patience, but my sense of obligation, my sense of responsibility, everything I had built around being the dependable one. I could feel my palms getting sweaty, my chest tightening further. The tension at the table was almost suffocating. My family sat there, watching me, waiting for my reaction. Every laugh, every polite smile, every soft word was part of the trap. And as I looked from Aunt Karen to Uncle Marcus to Jamal, I realized that they were in perfect sync. It wasn't just a plan, it was a performance, and I was the final act. The dessert sat untouched in front of me, the chocolate tart now mocking me with its sweetness. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the adrenaline made my thoughts sharper, almost frantic. I realized that if I gave in now, it would only embolden them. And yet, if I pushed back too soon, I risked creating a scene that would be remembered for years. The stakes had grown higher than I ever imagined, and the evening was spiraling into something far more complicated than a simple Christmas dinner. Suddenly, Jamal leaned over and whispered, "Don't worry, we wouldn't want to ruin your night. Just thought it'd be easier if everything was handled smoothly." His words were soft, but the meaning was clear. Smoothly in their eyes meant exactly what they wanted me to do. Pay. Everything else, every polite gesture, every compliment, every story about the past, was a setup. The realization hit me like a punch. They weren't just testing me, they were orchestrating a moment designed to see how much they could get from me. I shifted slightly, pretending to look at my phone again, but my mind was racing. I thought about all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways it could spiral into confrontation. And yet, a small part of me felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, I could see the full pattern, the manipulation, the expectations, the silent choreography of this dinner. And I realized that I had a choice: either continue to play the part they expected, or find a way to reclaim control. The waiter returned, and I could see my family subtly leaning back, almost in unison, as if holding their breath. The check sat there, innocuous on the table, yet loaded with expectation, with silent demands, with the power dynamics of years. I felt my heart pounding, every muscle on edge, every thought focused on the impossible choice ahead. The tension had reached a breaking point, and I knew that whatever happened next would determine not just the rest of this evening, but the way my family interacted with me moving forward. And just as I was about to reach for the check again, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I glanced at it, and my blood ran cold. It was a picture of the restaurant, taken from outside, showing me at the table with my family. The message was simple, chilling. "We're watching. Don't try anything." My hand froze midair. I looked up at my family, who were all smiling, calm, pretending nothing had changed. But in that instant, I realized this Christmas dinner was no longer just a test. It was a trap within a trap, and the stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level. My hand hovered over the check for what felt like an eternity. The weight of every expectation, every hidden motive, every subtle manipulation my family had laid out over the years pressed down on me. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, I imagined just giving in, pulling out my card, and letting them win, but then something inside me snapped. I realized I had been giving in my whole life, quietly letting patterns repeat, and tonight, I didn't have to anymore. I pushed the check slightly back toward the center of the table. "You know," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I've been thinking a lot tonight about what Christmas really means, about family and about respect." The table went quiet, each person caught off guard by the shift in my tone. I could feel Aunt Karen's eyes narrow slightly, Jamal's smirk falter, and Uncle Marcus's jaw tighten. This was my moment to take back control. "I came here expecting to enjoy a meal with my family," I continued, keeping my gaze steady, "not to be set up to pay for everyone's fun or to be manipulated. If Christmas is about anything, it should be about sharing, not taking advantage of each other." My voice grew stronger with every word, and I saw for the first time a flicker of surprise cross their faces. They weren't used to me speaking up like this, to drawing boundaries, to refusing to play their game. Jamal leaned back, clearly calculating, and Aunt Karen's hands tightened around her napkin. We didn't mean it like that," Aunt Karen started, her voice faltering just a little. "We were just joking," but her tone lacked conviction. I realized she hadn't expected resistance, hadn't prepared for me to confront the pattern directly. I let the silence hang, letting the tension build like a spotlight on the truth I was finally speaking aloud. "I'm not here to cover anyone's expenses because I've been treated like a doormat for years," I said, keeping my voice calm but unwavering. "From now on, I decide what I will and won't do. And tonight, I'm here to enjoy dinner without paying for anything I didn't agree to." The room went quiet. Even the waitstaff seemed to pause, sensing the shift in energy. For the first time in the evening, the power had moved from my family to me. Uncle Marcus finally spoke, his voice tight. "You've changed," he said, almost more to himself than to me. "You're different now." I nodded slightly, letting my confidence fill the space. "I have to be," I replied. "And this is what change looks like, setting limits, standing up for yourself, and expecting respect in return." I could see their surprise turning into a mixture of shame, realization, and confusion. My family had spent years underestimating me, and tonight, I had flipped the script entirely. As the tension slowly eased, I thought the night had reached its peak. I had reclaimed control, and the check remained untouched at the center of the table. But just as I was beginning to feel a glimmer of victory, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it, expecting maybe a random notification or a message from a friend checking in. But this time, it was a video message. My hands trembled as I opened it, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The video showed the restaurant from a corner, but it wasn't just the view of me and my family. It included a familiar face I hadn't expected to see, my younger cousin Lisa, the one Aunt Karen had mentioned earlier. She was smiling at the camera in a way that didn't match her usual shyness. Then her voice came over. "We set this up, but it's not just about the check. You've always been too easy to manipulate. We wanted to see if you'd finally stand up for yourself." My heart raced. I realized then that the situation had been layered, the manipulation deeper than I could have imagined. But what surprised me even more was what came next. The message continued. "We wanted you to see how far you've come. But also, Merry Christmas. Look under your chair." My hands shook as I looked down, and there, tucked neatly beneath the chair, was an envelope. Inside was a note with a simple message. "We respect you. Thank you for standing your ground." Alongside it was a small card for a gift, an unexpected acknowledgement from my family, a reward for my courage, and for breaking the cycle of being controlled. I sat back, my pulse finally slowing, a mix of relief and astonishment washing over me. The night had been tense, manipulative, and almost unbearable, yet somehow it had transformed into a moment of recognition and growth. My family, in their own convoluted way, had orchestrated the challenge, but instead of breaking me, it had given me clarity, strength, and a newfound sense of self-respect. I looked around the table at their faces, Aunt Karen, Uncle Marcus, Jamal, even Lisa, and I realized that in confronting the manipulation, I had changed the dynamics forever. There was still tension, of course, but it had shifted from being a weapon against me to a challenge I had met head-on. I could finally breathe, knowing I had taken control of the evening and, in a way, my relationship with them moving forward. And just when I thought the night had settled into a quiet resolution, Jamal leaned in with a sly grin. "By the way," he said, voice low and teasing, "we might have a little something extra waiting for you at home. Something to really keep you on your toes." I froze, my mind racing again, realizing that even though I had faced the trap at the restaurant, the story wasn't entirely over. My family still had a knack for surprises, and this Christmas had taught me that even the most carefully laid plans could come with another twist I hadn't expected. I smiled, a mixture of exhaustion, triumph, and cautious curiosity settling in. Tonight had been a test, a challenge, and a revelation all at once. And while I had emerged stronger and more aware, I knew one thing for certain. This Christmas dinner would be remembered, not just for the tension, the manipulation, or the check, but for the moment I finally stood up for myself, even as my family reminded me that life always had another twist waiting around the corner. This climactic section resolves the main conflict. Your protagonist stands up to the family manipulation, while including a final unexpected twist to keep the audience engaged and leaving room for future curiosity. After the initial shock of the video message and the note under my chair, a strange calm settled over the table. The tension that had been coiling around us like a tightly wound spring finally began to loosen. My family had seen me confront the manipulation directly, and for the first time in years, I felt the balance shift. I realized that the evening wasn't just about the check, or even about me standing up for myself. It was about everyone finally acknowledging that family could challenge each other, yes, but also support each other in meaningful ways. I looked around the table, taking in their expressions. Aunt Karen seemed a little softer, her usual carefully rehearsed smile replaced with one that actually felt genuine. Uncle Marcus, still trying to maintain his composure, gave me a small nod that spoke volumes. It was respect, subtle but undeniable. Jamal leaned back in his chair, smirk fading into something more like admiration, while Lisa, hiding partially behind her dessert plate, gave me a shy grin that suggested a little complicity in the surprise she had helped orchestrate. Somehow, even through manipulation and tension, the family had chosen to show me recognition rather than resentment. I finally reached for my glass and raised it slightly. "I think we all learned something tonight," I said, keeping my tone warm but firm. Christmas isn't about who pays or who manipulates. It's about honesty, respect, and appreciating each other. There was a pause, a rare moment of silence that felt almost sacred, before Aunt Karen nodded slowly. "You're right," she admitted. "Maybe we went about this all wrong. But I'm glad you spoke up. It's refreshing, actually." Her words weren't just an apology. They were a recognition of growth, both mine and hers. Jamal leaned forward with a small laugh, attempting to lighten the mood. Okay, I admit it. We might have pushed things a bit too far." There was honesty in his voice, a little vulnerability I hadn't heard before. And in that moment, I realized the entire dinner had been a convoluted way for all of us to confront patterns we hadn't spoken about in years. Their manipulation wasn't just about money or control. It was a reflection of habits, misunderstandings, and expectations that had been quietly building over time. We all settled back into our chairs, the desserts now feeling less like threats and more like comfort. I realized that what had felt like an elaborate trap was actually a turning point, a test of character, of boundaries, and of family dynamics. And even though it had been stressful, even though I had felt cornered and exposed, I couldn't deny that it had taught me something invaluable. I had learned to recognize manipulation, to stand up for myself, and to communicate boundaries without losing connection to the people I cared about. The conversation slowly shifted toward lighter topics. Uncle Marcus began telling a story from his childhood, one of his more embarrassing moments, and even Aunt Karen laughed without her usual calculation behind it. Jamal shared a small victory from work, and Lisa chimed in with a new hobby she had picked up. The laughter felt genuine this time, unburdened by expectation or hidden agendas. I realized how rare and beautiful it was to experience moments of authenticity within a family that could sometimes feel overly complicated or controlling. As the evening drew to a close, I felt a strange sense of closure. The check remained untouched, and no one pressed the issue further. In a way, leaving it there was symbolic. It represented the past, the expectations, and the manipulation that had been silently threaded through years of family interactions. By choosing not to engage, by setting a boundary, I had claimed control over my own actions and, in turn, my sense of self-worth. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. On the drive home, I reflected on the evening, replaying each conversation, each subtle glance, each unspoken expectation. I realized that while the manipulation had been uncomfortable and even painful, it had also been an opportunity for growth. It reminded me that family, even at its most complicated, is capable of change when confronted with honesty and courage. I had discovered that speaking up didn't have to lead to conflict. It could lead to understanding, even if it took a little time for everyone to process. Over the next few days, I noticed small but significant changes in my family. Aunt Karen called to check in, not to hint at obligations, but to genuinely ask how I was doing. Jamal sent a message joking about another dinner, but with a tone that suggested respect rather than expectation. Uncle Marcus invited me to help plan a family outing, this time as an equal partner in decision-making, not a silent contributor. Even Lisa, who had helped set up the subtle twists during dinner, seemed more open and willing to connect without games. These moments weren't huge, but they were meaningful. They showed that the boundaries I had set were being respected, and that change, even gradual, was possible. I also took some time to reflect personally. I realized that this Christmas dinner had been more than a test of generosity. It had been a lesson in self-respect, boundaries, and communication. It reminded me that being kind and generous doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity or allowing others to manipulate you. I carried that lesson with me, feeling a renewed sense of confidence, not just in family situations, but in life in general. I understood that setting limits wasn't selfish. It was necessary. And sometimes, the act of standing firm can transform relationships in unexpected ways. Weeks later, as the holiday season wound down, I found myself thinking back to that night again. I thought about the tension, the manipulation, the surprise twists, and finally, the moment when I reclaimed control. I realized that Christmas, in its chaotic and sometimes complicated glory, had given me more than a meal or a gathering. It had given me clarity, resilience, and a deeper understanding of family dynamics. I had faced discomfort head-on and come out stronger, and that feeling was something I knew I would carry with me for years. And yet, just when I thought the story had ended, there was one final twist. A small package arrived at my door a few days after Christmas. Inside was a simple card. "We're proud of you. Keep standing strong. Love, your family." Alongside the card was a modest gift, nothing extravagant, but its meaning was profound. It was acknowledgement, acceptance, and a subtle promise that even in a family that sometimes tested me, there was love. That final gesture reminded me that even complicated relationships could evolve, and that courage, honesty, and respect could create change in ways I hadn't imagined. Looking back, I realized that this Christmas dinner would always stay with me, not for the tension, the manipulation, or the check, but for the moment I stood up for myself, learned to recognize patterns, and discovered that boundaries could lead to deeper connection rather than division. It was a lesson in strength, resilience, and the importance of self-respect, and it was one I would carry into every future holiday, family gathering, and challenge life through my way. In the end, the evening that had started as a trap turned into a turning point. It wasn't about who paid the check or who controlled the night. It was about understanding, growth, and finally seeing my own worth. And as I placed the small card on my shelf, a reminder of both the challenges and the triumphs of that night, I felt a sense of peace. A Christmas, after all, wasn't just about tradition. It was about learning to navigate family, respect yourself, and find moments of genuine connection even in the most complicated situations.